This podcast is brought to you by Trivelo Coaching, where we help triathletes and cyclists like you train smarter to race faster. I'm your host, Jordan Donnelly, and on my left is former Australian Ironman Champion and head coach of Trivelo Coaching, Gerard Donnelly. One of the most common questions we get asked is, how should I train if I only have limited time available each week? We know the perfect training program would probably mean you train 15 to 20 hours a week, but for most age groupers, this just isn't realistic. And for many of you out there, you only have as little as 6 or 7 hours of training time available. So what should you do? Should you just give up on your goals because you can't compete with how much everyone else trains? Absolutely not. There's always ways to make it work, and we're going to identify today the key things you can do. As always, please remember our unwritten rule. If you enjoy our podcasts and find them helpful, the best thing you can do for us is share the podcast on your social media or to an endurance friend who you think might like it. And of course, this episode is brought to you by our proud sponsor, Giant Australia. For all your bike, training and racing needs, ride life, ride Giant. Dad, welcome back to another episode. Let's start with our normal first segment. What are you grateful for?
Thanks, George. This is going to be a good one. Time-efficient training, isn't it? And I think one of the things that I'm most grateful for, and I probably have mentioned it a few times in the 200 or so episodes that we've done, but I'm actually grateful to find your brother Matt's first boy, Archie. He's just started to walk after a year on this earth. But it's always amazing to me that how do infants with no muscle development or coordination have the ability to crawl first and then stand up, and they've got absolutely no muscle development at all. And how do they get everything to function in sync? That's the thing that really blows my mind when I watch the development of kids in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. And as a 2 or 3 year old, they can run with really good form, and yet they don't have any developed quads, calves, hamstrings, glutes. They're just super coordinated, and they get everything to work well. And as you know, Dr. Jordan Moncrief is a real advocate of doing a lot of functional training based on what kids' development is over their first 3 or 4 years, and it just reminds me all the time of when I see your other brother Liam's son Banks. He's about 2 or 3 months away from walking, but he's standing up now, and they've both got different body shapes. Archie's quite lean, and Banks is quite well built, and so it's interesting to see how they go about learning to use their what they've got as quickly as they can. So I love the fact that this is where a lot of the functional training sessions, and it's quite timely that, a lot of the questions we get asked about doing stuff away from your chosen sport, how's it going to help me? And if you just look at the way kids develop and how they get to use, how they make or allow their muscles to work together to enable them to crawl and to stand and to run, then these are the things we should be going back to the basics for to get ourselves strong again with our joints and muscles and tendons and ligaments, and that would be the most simplest thing you could do. And I'm grateful for watching this, because it keeps reminding me of how important this side of, because you look at swimmers who I've seen so many times where a really lean 12 or 13-year-old girl can just motor past some gym junkie guy who's built like a tank, but just can't swim. Whereas the lean girl's got the technique and her coordination down pat, and she looks graceful in the water, when this guy's just monstering the water and not getting anywhere. And they're examples of, it's not all about big muscles. It's all about how they work together.
Yeah, when we do some of the strength and conditioning work from Dr. Jordan Moncrief, as you said, a lot of the positions are really basic. And when you look at infants and kids, a lot of the positions he's trying to get you to sit in and work from are just really basic seated positions on the ground, and it's just impossible as an adult. The amount of sitting that we do and the amount of backwards work we do against our bodies works against us and make those exercises really difficult. But when you look at these kids, and they do them with ease, and they move with pure functionality, it's great to watch, and that's why we do love that DNS movement. My gratitude is on the family theme as well. I think I could make Mum my gratitude every single week. I don't know if I have actually, but grateful for Mum. She does so much work for our family, spend so much selfless time, doing everything for us and our family, and she's done it our whole life, and so very grateful for it, and really keeps this Travelo train running behind the scenes, I would say. So shout out to Mum for my gratitude this week.
Awesome.
Before we get into the main topic of the podcast, what's caught our attention at the moment is just some really big power meter mistakes that we just wanted to mention that we're seeing pop up in a range of athletes, beginners, people first getting used to their power meters, right through to people that have been using it for a while and still making these critical errors. So we just wanted to point out some things. If you're using a power meter, make sure you're doing these things right. And the first one is, are you using the right bike and the right power meter that you're going to use on race day, or are you using the wrong bike in training?
Yeah, the luxury, and it is a luxury because a lot of people now have more than one bike, and so if you're not in that category, you won't be making this mistake because you only have one bike. So you're not going to go down this rabbit hole. But for most people, they might have a time trial bike and they might have a road bike, and for other people now, it could also be a shed full of gravel bike and mountain bikes. And you could potentially, as well as your smart trainer, have up to 5 different power meters in your possession when you decide to go for a training session on a bike. And I think the thing that we need to really establish from the outset is, what event are you training for? And that will dictate what bike you're going to predominantly use. You can use all the bikes, the gravel, the mountain bike, the time trial bike, and the road bike. I'm happy for that to happen. I'm happy for you to be indoors and use your smart trainer power meter. But we need to understand, at the end of the day, the race that we've entered, that's the bike that we need to spend most of the time on. And if that happens to be a criterium or a time trial or a triathlon or a road race or a mountain climbing stage as a mountain biker or a gravel endurance ride, you need to spend the most time on the bike that you're going to ride on that day. And that's not to say you can't use those other bikes, but we want to make sure that's the first thing you're thinking about. So the key sessions, they're the times to be using that particular bike. And the other sessions, such as recovery or just coffee rides or even rides with your mates where they're all on a particular bike that's not the sport you're doing, then join in with that. If you're doing a base phase at the start of the season and you're a triathlete doing a half Ironman, which has got a 90k time trial in it, but we've asked you to do some strength work, it's okay to ride your road bike in the hills for those sessions. It's okay. I'd prefer you still got used to riding your time trial bike in the hills, but it is okay to do that. And they're things that they're not mistakes. They're just identifying what is important and what's not important. And I think that would be the first thing that people should start to think about and start to form what bike am I going to ride and why and when is it most useful.
The follow-on from that is practicing your position as well, and this is more applicable to the time trial position on the time trial bike, but doesn't include everything, because if you're going to be doing a hill sort of challenge, then you need to get practice what position you're going to be riding up the hill, even on your road bike, and practice riding in the hills, because a lot of people tend to get to the hills and then realize that their back's really sore from a certain position, or they need to practice standing up for periods, that kind of thing. But specifically the time trial position, I was on a ride last week and happened to just be behind a guy who was on the time trial bike practicing his time trial position, and we were on a very undulating circuit, and on the uphills I noticed he was getting into the TT position, and then over the crest and down the hill he was sitting up and pulling up, and you can never judge what someone's doing because you have no idea what their session is or what the goal is for that session. But I would assume that if you're on the TT bike and you're trying to practice that, you want to spend as much time in that as possible, and you want to spend as least time outside of the TT position and with the hands on the sides, and especially over that crest and down where you're going to get more speed, and that's where you really want to practice it. And it's good to be in it on the uphill, but we were hitting some steep segments and he was staying in that TT position, which is fine. But yeah, unless you're going around a sharp corner and you're not so confident, or it's a really steep downhill for a safety measure, then you can pull up. But really practicing as much time as possible in that position, because that's what you want to achieve on race day, and that's the most aero position to be in.
Yeah, so just following on that point, I'm sort of surprised sometimes when I'm saying to people, how did it feel in that session that you just completed? You're comfortable in TT position. Oh, and sometimes the answer comes back as, I didn't do that in the TT position. I just sat up because I can push more power in that position. And that to me is a mistake. You need to be doing the right power in the position you're going to try and do it on race day. Because you'll get to race day and say you've been trying to aim at 200 watts in those training sessions, and come race day, and you've been doing it sitting up, and come race day when you're in the TT position because you're trying to be as aerodynamic and fast as possible, you can't get anywhere near 200 watts, and you're then questioning what's wrong with me, and you'll start to change your race strategy, and it's purely because you've actually been training in the wrong position, and that is such an important point. If you are a time trialist in a triathlon, you need to be training in the time trial position in those specific training sessions, and the minute you're doing any of those efforts out of that position, that's actually giving you an inflated power number. That is not possible to do in the TT position. So you need to test yourself in the TT position. Then you need to train in that same position. And so that is one of the things that I think people are really getting wrong. And not only in the position, but they're actually training, doing an FTP test sometimes on the wrong bike, and then going to do some other sessions based on outdoor training based on the same power number, but because it's on a different bike, they can't match those numbers, because guess what? The position's different because of the geometry of the frame between a road bike and a time trial bike, and the power meter is most definitely probably not going to read the same. So you're going to have different values for two different power meters. I've got 4 power meters in this room where I'm sitting, and not one of them reads the same. And that includes a smart trainer. Like, I know on my time trial bike, my time trial bike power meter reads 10 watts higher than my smart trainer does. And so if I trained using the smart trainer's power meter and then went to a race with those numbers, then I would be riding power too low in that race because it's 10 watts lower. And therefore I would actually not, I would be losing. I'd ride poorly. And if, in your example, your smart trainer reads higher. So you'll do the opposite thing that's going to happen. You're going to ride the wrong power in the other direction, which is going to make, your race so much harder.
Yeah, our general rule is we just don't use the smart trainer's power, just ever. Every training session where you connect to the smart trainer, if you're doing an indoor session, but you select your actual power meter. You don't select the smart trainer's power, because it's just not really useful, because you're never going to use it outdoors or race day. So it's just a kind of blanket rule for us. And yeah, so we want to keep pointing out these mistakes just to make sure that if you are using a power meter, which we hope you are, you're just not making any of these, because you might be doing 6 out of 7 of these right, but there's one thing you're doing wrong, and that's actually affecting potentially your performance on race day. And yeah, we just highlighted if you're going to use a smart trainer indoors, not using the power meter on the smart trainer, but using your own power meter instead. And the other one is understanding that on the same bike and the same power meter, you could still have different numbers depending on if you've done a hill climb FTP or a flat course FTP or an undulating, and they're not equal. So you can't really use your hill number versus your flat number. And that is a really hard concept to grasp. And you would think, that doesn't make sense. The power is me, and what I'm pushing, it's the same bike. Why is that incorrect?
Yeah, it's a beauty, because you could have an indoor power FTP. You could have an outdoor on the flat power FTP, and you could have a hill climbing. And
all on the same power meter on the same bike in the same position.
Right. Yeah. And you could do that. If you were not listening to our advice, you could have them all on 3 different power meters, and and therefore you would be that confused when you come to do your next training session. So why would we have an FTP for hill climb? Why would we have one for flat outdoor? And why would we have one for indoor? Because we want to train very accurately. And if we're deciding that the next training block, it's in the middle of winter and it's snowing outside, and we can't go outside to do any training sessions, we're going to rely on our indoor FTP. And that could be 5 watts lower than your outdoor flat FTP and 15 watts lower than your hill climbing FTP. So we're going to train with the number that we've tested on. And if you come into summer like we are in the Southern Hemisphere, and you're not going to use the indoor trainer at all, then we want to use our outdoor flat FTP for our outdoor training sessions that we might be doing on the courses around our house or on a velodrome or whatever the outdoor sessions we're going to use. And then if we're going to do some hill training programs, like there are going on in March this year in Victoria, there's a huge race called Three Peaks. And if you are using your flat FTP power number for your hill climbing, you would definitely be riding too low, because you can ride probably 5% higher against the gradient of a hill. And that's the key point. Why are the numbers different? Because you're not generating the power on a climb. The hill is pushing against you. So it's easier to push against the resistance. When you're on the flat, you have to generate your power yourself because there is no resistance from the gradient. There might be some wind resistance, which will help you to push against to give you some more power. But, generally we want to do out and back. So we're going to have tailwind and headwind. So that'll equal itself out. So the power from a hill climbing test should be the highest because the gradient is allowing you to push against it. The power from the flat outdoors should be next highest, and the power from indoor, that is a really difficult thing because you are not moving around the bike as much as you can outdoor. You're stuck in one spot. And so therefore, sometimes it's harder to generate more power indoor. There are exceptions to that, but that's the general consensus that we've had from the athletes that we've coached.
Absolutely. Last few in terms of power meter mistakes, making sure that all your settings are updated correctly. So whether you're reading your power on your watch or your head unit on Zwift or on Training Peaks, just making sure that your FTP settings are updated because you might load a session onto Zwift, but when you start the session, if you haven't got the right FTP set, then it's going to spit out different numbers than what you should be training to. And especially if you're changing bikes, potentially changing power meters between sessions, you've really got to make sure that before the session you keep updating that. If you're looking on Training Peaks, for example, then making sure that you've set that FTP correctly in your settings so it's giving you the right data to look at. And same thing if you're loading the session onto your Garmin or your head unit and watch. That's just a really important point to keep on top of because you could potentially get to a session, forget to change it, and then you'll just be, we would assume this wouldn't happen because I personally just, I'm really well on top of what kind of numbers I'm going to push for this session. I'm really aware of it. And I can't imagine a situation where we personally just would look at numbers and not see that they're incorrect. But we do understand that when you're new to power and you're not used to seeing the numbers and you kind of have no idea what your ability is, you'll just be looking at numbers and have no idea what they mean. So you could easily just look at the numbers, not even know that they're wrong, and do an entirely wrong session.
Well, generally the format should be you do an FTP test and Training Peaks can have a button where you can automatically let Training Peaks adjust it. We don't recommend you do that. We recommend that you manually adjust your FTP every time because for some reason, if your power meter overreads or underreads, if you've selected the automatic on Training Peaks, it will put a number that's not real. And some training sessions, people are getting 2,000 watts of max power. Well, that's not a real outcome. That's something gone wrong with the power meter. So that's an example of, not taking control yourself. So you should manually update your FTP only when you know you've improved. And, the scenario is if you're indoors and you open up Zwift will automatically change it from a previous best FTP. And you have no control over that. So you have to actually manually change it back if it's not a real number. So you could actually have an FTP number on your Training Peak session, and then you're looking at the Zwift screen, and that's set to a different number. So all of a sudden, in the one training session, you've got two different power meters at play with power FTPs set differently. And that's a disaster waiting to happen. It's so confusing.
It sounds really pedantic, but the consequences are really frustrating because if you don't do it properly, the session's either going to be way too hard and you're going to fail it and feel like crap and wonder what's wrong with me, or it's going to be far too easy and you've just kind of wasted an hour on the trainer where you haven't really gotten much out of it. And especially when today's topic is how to make sure that every hour counts. If you only got 6 or 7 hours, you can't afford to waste an hour training session where you didn't get the most out of your body if that was a hard session.
Spot on. And look, it doesn't take much to just make sure the Zwift FTP is set the same. You go into settings, and then, if you're Garmin or if that's what you're using, that's also got an FTP. So if you're running your Training Peak session through your Garmin, you're running it through Zwift, and your Training Peak session, there's 3 different settings that you need to be on top of. And that is crucial to getting the most out of every training session you're doing.
Last couple, if you do update your power meter, if you get a new one, if you upgrade, be really careful not to compare to your old one because it could read similar, it could read totally different. And it really sucks sometimes if you get a new one and it reads 30 watts lower than your old one because it feels like a bit of an ego boost. But I mean, that doesn't happen too often, but it has definitely happened to some athletes of ours. You just have to cop that. And you just got to really keep that in mind, especially be careful, 6 months down the track. That you're not comparing apples with oranges and you're not comparing the data now from 6 months ago off a different power meter. That's where recording your own data really consistently and not just recording your power, but what power it created to what speed. And that's where comparing data from 6 months ago could be really valuable.
You could go one step further, Jordan. In your data spreadsheet, just make a note at the end of each of those testing periods. This was my Quark. This was my
Mm-hmm.
Favero Asayamo. This was
Mm-hmm.
my Garmin power.
Yep.
Whatever the power meter is, just make a note of it, and that would make sense. I actually was looking at Strava today from a session that I did and I've lived in the Dandenongs for 37 years, so I've done this particular climb, I don't know how many times, but I was looking at it, what I'd done 6 years ago, just to try and see if I'm actually improving or not. And this is an example of how the power meter has changed from when I rode 6 years ago. And so the time was something like 23 minutes, and my power was 245 watts. And 6 years ago, I looked for a time that was similar, 23 minutes. It was almost, I'm trying to find, there's a lot of sessions I've done. So I found one, and it read 265 watts with my old power meter.
Mm-hmm.
So sure, my weight could have been different, but I'm actually heavier now than I was then. So the number today should have been higher than the one 6 years ago when I was lighter.
Yep.
But in fact, for the same time, 6 years ago, power meter was 20 watts higher than
Mm-hmm.
today. And
Yep.
that's a great example of what you just said.
Yeah, yeah, and as always, we go, well, you could have ridden the actual hill differently, and that would create different power as well. So there's many factors, but that's why we have to look at it, and that's why we keep track of as much data as possible. Last one on the power is just making sure you're calibrating before every session, and that's hard on race day because there are plenty of examples where on race day, especially in triathlons, you have to rack your bike well before you get to start or before you're actually going to jump on the bike. So that can be a bit frustrating, and it does happen where you calibrate it, but it means nothing because by the time you get back, the power ranger is not calibrated again. But that's where you have to be aware of your own numbers, your own speed, your own RPE, which is really tough, and compare it all, not just be blindly looking at power.
Yeah, and I suppose there are exceptions with races where you don't have any control over it, but in training you have control over calibrating your power meter. And look, if you're that lazy and you can't spend 20 seconds calibrating your power meter every single time you ride your bike, well, I think there's you need to rethink about your time management, because it is so important. There's so many sessions where I've actually forgotten to do it,
Yeah.
and I felt like, gee, this feels really hard on the trainer here, and then I've stopped and recalibrated, and all of a sudden now it's really comfortable. It's because the power meter was 5 or 6% out. So you just need to do that every session, and most power meters will give you a number when you calibrate.
Mm-hmm.
Some power meters don't. They just say calibration successful. But whatever the response is, you need to make sure that that happens every time. So, the example I've got 3 different power meters in the house, and they've all got different numbers that spit back at me. I've just got to remember what they are for what bike. So there's a little bit of information that you need to be across for that as well.
And if you can't remember that number, because sometimes it's really random, it's like 487 or something, I'll even just calibrate it 2 or 3 times just to be really pedantic and really sure that, okay, it's spitting out the same number every time. I'm happy with that. Let's move into the topic, because that's what everyone's here for. They want to know that if you've got limited time, how do you structure a training program around that? So, as always, the first answer is it depends, but take us through the scenarios of how you would answer this question depending on the athlete.
Yeah, well, I try to break it down, I suppose, into what are your actual goals for the time you have available. And we're talking anything under 10 hours here. And it could be, look, minimum could be for a marathon runner 3 or 4 hours of training a week, and for a triathlete, 8 or 9, for a cyclist, 6 or 7. So anything in those ranges for those particular disciplines. So what are your goals? And that will answer a lot of the questions that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to break it into 3. One is your goal is to just not lose fitness over this period of time, because you're so time limited. You are just happy to train and not expect to improve, because you're not training like you used to in terms of time, but you want to maintain fitness. You don't want to go backwards. So that's the first category. The second category would be you're limited in time because of whatever the reason, job changes or family, or and you want to still improve, but you don't have much time. I want to talk about that. And then what about the third category? The person who, regardless of the time available, wants to be super competitive and just be like his competitors and be good enough with half the time that the other competitors are using. So they're the
That's
three scenarios.
the ambitious person at the top. Yeah.
They're the three goals I want to kind of discuss.
Yeah. So go through. So if it's level 1, 2, or 3, maintenance, improvement, or ultra competitive, what's kind of the general rule around them?
Yep. So the maintenance one's really simple. You don't have to flog yourself. You can maintain a good level of aerobic fitness if you just stayed around zone 2 till the cows come home, as they say. So we're just happy with pressure on the pedals, getting some aerobic stimulation, cardiac heart rate, cardiovascular systems not being stressed too much, but it's actually working. So you couldn't spend all the time just in zone 1. You would need to spend some time with pressure on the pedals, going right up to the top of 75% of your FTP. And that will allow you to go the whole time. So if you're a bike rider and you've got 6 or 7 hours available and you are not worried about improvement, but you could do all of those as zone 2 rides and really enjoy it and be able to ride with a whole lot of social rides in there, and that would be a really good outcome because normally you would probably ride just above zone 2 in those bunch rides, depending on the standard of your bunch ride. But you then have the freedom to just to know that I'm still maintaining my fitness because I am actually riding at that zone 2 level, which is technically if you use the zone system, a lot of the best scientific research tells us that if you spend 80% of your time zone 2 or lower and 20% of your time at zone 3 or 4 or higher, you are going to improve incredibly. So we're just taking away that high intensity just so that you can actually get through this period of maintenance training.
And the key point there is that you can train harder if you want, but you just don't need to. And a lot of people feel like they will lose fitness unless they train hard. And you're saying that no, if you just did zone 2, you'll be pretty good. Obviously, you won't improve and you won't be at that ultra competitive side, but you'll be pretty good at maintaining.
Yeah, and there'll be a point if you did that for a long, long period of time where your fitness would start to lose, and that's why the intensity is important at some point in time. And I suppose that's what point 2 is.
Yep.
The goal of I want to stay healthy and fit, but I still want to see some improvement, and that's us just adding one more session. That's just adding an intensity session once a week or once every fortnight, whatever your schedule is, once every 10 days. And that high intensity session needs to be at threshold or higher. You don't want to spend that time in that grey zone, which is between zone 2 and zone 4. That grey zone is for people who can spend 15 to 20 hours a week training.
To clarify there, when you say zone 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, we're using a 5-zone model in this example, and we know that every podcast or every video might use a 3-zone model or a 5 or 6-zone model, but zone 2 is anything below that first lactate threshold. Above threshold is that zone above zone 4 is above that lactate 2 threshold. So the grey zone you're talking about is between the lactate thresholds, LT1 and LT2. That's zone 3 and 4. So
yeah. So we want to spend some time up to zone 2, LT1, lactate threshold 1, anything in that area. And then we want to spend that other session at threshold or VO2 or anaerobic. So that could look like 60-30s, anything under a minute with short recovery, 40-20s, 30-15s, 30 on, 15 off. It could 3 by, 3 minutes times 2 sets with 3 minutes recovery. That's an example of that high intensity session. And if you're doing things that are less intense than that at threshold, that's where you're doing your 5x5s at 100 to 108% of your FTP with 2.5 minutes rest period in between. So they're 2 examples of different sessions that are high intensity, but they're challenging different aerobic systems. So it's really important that as long as you're doing 1 or 2 of those sessions, alternating is fine. Concentrating on one of those for a structured period and then swapping over is fine. But doing one of those is important to give you the stimulus so that you're looking for to improve.
And so if we break that down into actual sessions, let's say we're talking about a cyclist, they've got 6 to 7 hours a week to train, that might look like two zone 2 sessions that could be between 60 and 90 minutes each, one high intensity session, which is generally around the hour mark or just above. Then that leaves room for an endurance ride of potentially 3 to 4 hours to fit in there. And it all depends on who you are, and when you've got 67 hours, is that based over 3 days only? You've only got 3 days to train. In that case, like you're saying, you're probably doing one zone 2, one endurance ride, which might still be zone 2 or with some intensity, and one intensity ride, or you might be able to split it over 4 sessions, like the example I just gave. So it is dependent, but we're just giving a breakdown of what those sessions might look like.
Yeah, that's a good summary, and it depends on how many days you can train. And if you've got 5 days and you've only got 5 hours, then that takes away your endurance ride straight away. So that's a scenario that's really going to make it difficult. And therefore, you've got to try and make sure that most of those 5 hours, 4 of those 5 hours are all at zone 2.
So that's a good example. Let's say if you've got 5 days to train, but you can only train for an hour max a day or an hour and a half. Just for, you might have a full day of sport with kids or something over the weekend, Saturday, Sunday, and you just can never fit in a 3 or 4 hour ride during your week. That's just not possible. Ultimately, if you could, that would be preferable. Getting an endurance session in, whether it's cycling, running, as part of triathlon as well. But yeah, it's a good specific example that just no matter what your week is, you're never going to be able to get away from the family for 3 to 4 hours at once. It's just too unfair. So yeah, talk to us a little bit more about that, and how would you break down the week then?
Yeah, and that's where the intensity is going to give you the best bang for your buck. So we're trying to do some zone 2 stuff. We're not going to spend time recovering, because the rest of the 23 hours out of the 24 that you're not training, you are doing some sort of recovery in that period. So we want to make sure that we really push ourselves in possibly 2 or 3 of those hours out of the 5 that you've got, if that's what your limit is, or 6 hours. So if it's 3 1-hour efforts where you're spreading that apart Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, you would want to be doing threshold or above in all of the 3 of those sessions. And an example would be to do 2 structured sessions and try to get, if you're training indoor, try to get a race on Zwift, something like that, where it's unpredictable training, where you're in the middle of a race and someone attacks and there's a hill comes up and you've got to get with the bunch and stay with them, so you've got to ride the high power. So they're really great ways of fitting in some high intensity with some fun. But you really want to make sure the other 2 days you are actually getting the correct stimulus, which is VO2 up to anaerobic or the threshold, and they're the things you can't really avoid if you've only got that small amount of time.
Yeah, I want to continue on that in a second, but the last kind of example we wanted to talk about was the ultra competitive athlete, the one who still has a very limited time to train, but still wants to be competitive. Is that a similar kind of answer?
It is, but we would have to say to that person, if you don't have the time for the endurance ride, then you're not going to be competitive. Mm-hmm. And that would be a thing that they would have to really take on board. Mm-hmm. So that example we use where a person only had, and that would be very rare, by the way, if someone only had 1 hour every time. But we're trying to give enough scenarios so it can fit the listener who's listening. Or that suits me, or this doesn't suit me. But if you've got 3 1-hour sessions available, but you've got the weekend, you can ride 3 or 4 hours. That ultra competitive person will have a really good program, and they can be really quite competitive if they're really using their endurance ride the way that they need to, compared to someone who's got 20 hours a week. The endurance ride for that person, the ultra competitive person with limited time, that endurance ride, or for a marathon runner, that endurance run, that has to have some intensity in it. And for a runner, you would use the hills, and you would just increase the effort on the hills a little bit more than if you had 10 12 hours of running each week. When you've only got 3 or 4 hours of running, you would actually try to run some of the hills a little bit more solid. And for a bike rider, you would absolutely try to get some bunch rides where it's really hard and it's unpredictable and you're racing against your mates. And then you would add zone 2 stuff in your cool down so that you're getting that aerobic fitness when you're tired after 2 3 4 hours. As I was speaking to someone before, he's asking, should I do longer midweek rides coming up for this big event that I'm doing? And I'm saying, well, you should be doing that anyway if you've got the time. If you've got the time, add more time to you. We've said that so many times. Add more time to your cool down and make sure that doesn't go over zone 2, which is anything up to 75%. But 60% of your FTP is where you should be sitting on that cool down. Down to as low as 40%. So anything between that 40 to 75, but try and hone in on 60%. To get the best bang for your buck if you're limited for time. The listener needs to understand we're only talking about people who have got less hours in the day, in the week, in the month to train to. We're not talking about people who've got all the time in the world to fit the best structured program into their week. So it is important that you use that endurance ride. That is the difference, Jordan. Making sure that we get the value out of that endurance ride, because in the others, in the maintenance person or the improvement, plus just trying to maintain, there's potentially going to do some intensity, but they're not got the time to do the long endurance stuff. And if you're spending another example I just thought of then, if you're actually spending time driving to let's start again. So if you're actually riding your bike, going through traffic to get to the endurance ride where there's some hills, you're actually commuting rather than actually training. And I would rather you did drive to the hills and then spent the 3 or 4 hours that you've got in the hills, rather than commuting and spending an hour in the hills and then commuting back and getting a total of 3 or 4 hours.
Yep.
That is going to be the best bang for your buck. So you need to be up at 4 o'clock in the morning, be ready to ride on your bike in summer at 6 a.m. so that you have to be home by 10. You've got 3 hours from 6 till 9, a commute back home 10 o'clock. Your day's done and you've had 3 great hours in the hills, and you haven't spent the whole time stopping and starting at traffic lights all the way out there and getting one hill in and then doing the same on the way home.
Yeah, that's great. There's one particular traveller I can think of that is constantly really strapped for time, and they somehow manage to just maintain a really good level of fitness. And then when they have periods where they've got a little bit more time, they can really step up and they smash it. And they really do prioritise the endurance ride as much as they can, which is not all the time, but when they can, they do it. And if not, they're basically just getting on the bike and smashing themselves for short, sharp periods. And we've spoken about our winters with series where we hold races within the Travello group, and this athlete would literally get home from work so late that they jump on the bike 5 minutes before the race, whereas everyone else is getting the most out of the session, where they're doing the extras, they're doing a great half-hour warm-up, it's building a good aerobic capacity, getting themselves really warmed up for the race, and this athlete will just get on, do the 35-minute race as hard as they can, get off, finish the day's work after that, and they are literally using every minute they have just to do the high intensity part, but they're getting a huge benefit out of it. Obviously, if they did a half-hour warm-up and a half-hour cool-down, it was an hour-and-a-half session, they're going to get great aerobic benefit out of that, but they still are able to maintain really good fitness and be riding really well just from doing something like that and getting the actual hard race in.
And look, I know every athlete's different, but the amount of limited time this person has proved to me that with small, well-balanced, structured training sessions, you can still be at a level that's super competitive. And this guy was part of the Nationals winning teams time trial at Buninyong in the Australian titles here in January, and I reckon his previous 2 or 3 weeks before that, he might have ridden his bike twice or 3 times. Yet he was, he was able to, because when he did ride his bike, he rode, max efforts in his sessions. He maintained that good structure. And look, that will fall apart. There's no doubt about that. When that goes on for 2 or 3 months, you will lose fitness. You will not be the rider you are. So we're not talking about that. We're just talking about the opportunities you have with the limited time for a period of time. But if you try to do this, for 2 or 3 years, you would not be an improvement situation. You'll just be almost like a bipolar rider. You'll have good periods and bad periods, and you just keep doing that up and down. Geez, I'm feeling good now, and I haven't trained for a while. And now I'm struggling again, and I'll do a couple of good weeks of training. Now I'm going good again, and you're never actually getting any better. And so we're not talking about that athlete. We're talking about someone who is actually doing exactly what they should be doing in the limited time they have. And answering that question, can you still be at the top of your game? Well, you can. It is a lot harder pathway to follow, but it is possible if you're really committed and you are on top of the details and you don't waste a session. That is actually the key thing.
We actually had the founder of the 80-20 rule, and where all this dialogue comes from around, you should be doing 80% of your training easy and then only a small section hard. That was Dr. Stephen Seiler. And we asked him this question and said, well, yeah, if you what if you've got limited sessions? What if you can only train 3 times a week? And he said, well, it's super simple. You go really hard on those sessions. And he said the caveat is as long as you're giving yourself enough time to recover, because you can't just smash yourself all the time. But he said if I can only train 3 times a week, then for sure I'm doing 3 high-intensity sessions. That's going to give me the best bang for my buck.
Yeah, and it's kind of almost shocking to hear a scientist say, it's okay to go and smash yourself. But, the reality is it's 3 times out of 7 days. And you've got, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, probably opportunities to do that, or Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday. And, you've got ample recovery time in there. So, you would be doing yourself an injustice if you actually didn't use those sessions. If your goal, remember, is to be competitive.
Once again, that's not going to work long term though. So when someone says, "Oh, I'll just smash it for a period," you go, "Oh, that's even still not a good idea, even if you've only got 3 sessions." Why is that?
Yeah, because eventually, the endurance component of the training is what is our base, and if we keep, and I'm really strong on this with the people we coach, if people are missing out of the last 8 or 10 weeks, and I see they've done 5 out of the 10 endurance day sessions, the correlation between their form falling and those sessions is massive. And so that tells me every time that, if you start missing the endurance, then eventually your form and your fitness will start to dissipate very quickly. And all of a sudden you'll be asking yourself, well, why aren't I riding like I was 12 weeks ago? Well, the key component that's gone is the endurance ride. And that just brings that strength in the mitochondria to be able to hold form when you're getting tired, and the cell development and the breakdown of the fatigue you get from 4 or 5 hour rides, or 3 hours and above if you're doing some strength work. And that is incredible for the body to really maintain its peak form. And I think that is going to be a game changer. Even if you still do the intensity stuff midweek, there'll be a time where, I've seen the example of when summer comes around, no matter where you are in the world, there's a lot more opportunities to race. So the people who, and we've got examples of people who like to race 2 or 3 times a week, which I'm not a big fan of, but that's what they love doing. So let's let them do what they love doing. But I have to say to them, if you choose this method of summer riding, the consequence is that you'll form eventually by the 3rd month of summer. Summer's generally going to go for, with a bit of good weather in spring and a bit of good weather in autumn, you could have a 4 to 5 month period of really great racing. But by the time you get to month 3 and 4, if you haven't done any endurance and all you've done is race Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday with no endurance, your form will actually deteriorate, and you will be a lot worse rider at the end of summer as compared to the person who races less and actually gets the endurance ride in. They're still getting the intensity from the race. They're still getting their dopamine fix from having
Competing,
a competition in their blood, but they're still maintaining their fitness, and they can do that for 6 months of the period that we're talking about, and be actually better at the end of the season because they've had the right fitness levels all the way through and they haven't dropped off.
Yeah, it's such a great point, and it really reiterates what you said earlier about how valuable that endurance session is. And if you can't fit that in, you've just got to expect that you're probably not going to improve the way you want and be competitive in the way you want. And it just that example we gave before of that athlete that is doing the absolute minimum but maintaining a good level. That's because that athlete is only ever doing short time trial races where they're doing 15 to 30-minute efforts, and they can maintain that, or they're doing hour crit races. They're not doing anything longer, and if they did, they would struggle because they're just not doing any of that endurance. And so they're really good at that specific kind of tempo because they can keep that up in their training. But it just highlights a really big point that if you're an endurance athlete, if you're a triathlete, this isn't going to apply as well because you just won't be good for anything over an hour and a half because you're not doing any specificity for it.
Yeah, and as a competitive marathon runner, the example would be the same. If you're trying to train for a marathon or an ultra distance run, which is longer than a marathon, 50, 60 kilometers, or some people up to 100 kilometers, if you can't get that endurance run into your body, you shouldn't be targeting those events. You will be fine if as a marathon, as a runner, and you can't have the time for it. You have to think twice about what events you should be doing. And so if that you're in that scenario where you can't do that endurance run, then marathon should be stepping down to half marathon. That would be my advice. And you'll have some similar fun experiences doing 5Ks and 10Ks and making your main race the half marathon, rather than, blindly saying I'm an endurance marathon runner and that's what I'm going to do, but I've only got, X amount of time and my longest run I can do is 90 minutes. Well, you're going to have a bad experience on marathon day if your longest run is going to be 90 minutes. You need to have some capacity. And that's what the topic is. If you've got limited time, then you need to think about, what is my goal? Is it, maintenance? Is it just get a little bit of improvement, or ultra competitive? And if you're a marathon runner and you don't have the endurance day available to you, you shouldn't be doing that event.
So let's finish off with what would the breakdown be for a triathlete? Let's say a triathlete only has 6 to 7, maybe up to 8 or 9, but let's go really specific with they've got absolutely limited time per week. How do you break it down between the 3 disciplines?
Yeah, well, I suppose the simplest way is to say how much time is spent in the race, and that should be reflective of what you do in swim, bike, and run. And to be fair, people have got 20 hours. It's still the same scenario. I still apply that philosophy of, if I spend overtime swimming, undertime riding, and undertime running, I'm going to be improving my swimming incredibly. But that could improve me 2 or 3 minutes. Whereas if I spent more time riding and running, I could possibly get up to 5 or 10 minutes improvement. So it's where you're going to get the best bang for your buck. So unfortunately, swimming becomes a maintenance thing if you're limited in time. And I don't mean as in the effort, it just means once a week. If you're struggling to do 7 hours of training, you're going to have to spend 2 or 3 hours, depending on your event, whether it's 70.3 or Ironman. And again, the same philosophy, probably not a good idea to do an Ironman if you've only got 7 hours of training time available.
Mm-hmm.
Half Ironman is really pushing it. Olympic distance is probably where you should be, selecting. So I'm really pushing that idea of think about, with the time you've got available, what should I be doing? And, if you've been an endurance athlete and that's what your passion and desire is, look, use this time, where you've got limited time to do a different event, which is shorter, and, you might surprise yourself and enjoy that just as much. But if you can't do that endurance run and ride as a triathlete, then you're going to be limited in how well you're going to perform on race day, because you're going to be exposed. After, if you're doing a half Ironman and you've swum, basically 2K and tried to ride 90 and run half a marathon, if you haven't done any riding or running that's in that 7 hours, that's been somewhere around the time it's going to take you to ride that 90K. And for some athletes, that's 3 hours. For other athletes, that's 2.5. And for the run, it could be an hour and a half and 2.5 hours for the half marathon. So you've got to have that time in your training program. So what does that leave you? If you've done some long runs that are 2 hours and you've done some rides that are 3 hours, there's 5 out of your 7 or 8 hours that you've got available.
Mm-hmm.
So those other 3 or 4 hours have to be a little bit of a swim and, some sort of running and some sort of riding in those other 3 hours. So that's where you shouldn't be doing the 2 to 3 hour ride and the hour and a half to 2 hour run. You should select another event in triathlon, another distance as an Olympic distance, and you'd be having more fun that way as well.
And the 80-20 rule can really, again, be thrown out here. If you go into, let's say you opt for the Olympic distance at this amount of training, then you could really just get quite specific and just do a lot of your training at race pace zone. And, if it's a 40K TT, which might take you an hour to an hour and a half, and if it's a 10K run, which again might take you 40 minutes to an hour 10, you could potentially do an hour ride with a half hour run at race pace and do that consistently. And you'll get really specifically good at that race pace.
Yeah, so I think the scenario should be, I have to rethink my event, and then I can fit my time into it. So the caveat would be, yes, you can still be competitive, but not as an endurance athlete. Anything that's, as a runner, 5K, 10K, up to half marathon with limited time. As a triathlete, absolutely, sprint, Olympic, no problems. Pushing the envelope depending on how many hours you've got for half Ironman.
I guess that kind of summarizes it. Any other final words on fitting a structured training program on unlimited time?
No, I just think you've got to be really more realistic in your expectations, and make sure that you select the goal about how you want to go about your fitness? Are you going to maintain? Are you happy to maintain with a little bit of improvement, or are you super competitive? And once you've established that, then select the event that is going to allow you to fulfill that goal that you're really setting as your target during this period where you've got limited time. And the whole scenario of this podcast was to set up an expectation that you can still be an athlete. You can still be competitive. You can still compete in events, but as long as you're realistic about your performance and have that correlation between training time, expectation, and outcome.
That's a great way to finish. Yeah, we hope this helps anyone out there with limited time, because there's definitely a lot of people in that position. We want to give you hope that it's definitely still possible, and you can definitely get a lot out of yourself. You don't have to be doing so many extra hours at Zone 2, and there is actually a little bit of a myth, I think, in the industry about how many hours you should be doing. And I even saw one pro cyclist talk about how they can't remember the last time they did a 30-plus hour week, even though it seems to be a well-known thing that all elite athletes do 30 plus hours. And we've spoken a lot on the podcast about elite cyclists. They're doing their 2 key races, and then everything around that is just super easy and not even that long. So don't fall into a trap thinking that more is always better. You can get a lot out of your week with shorter time. So we want to look at both sides of the argument. We hope we've provided that today. So that's it for this episode. As always, we'll see you on the next one.